are a lot of things about this life that I don't understand. And as I said last week, some of those things we can laugh about, but some of those things are really, really hard. Like, why is there so much abuse in the world? Why do innocent children suffer? Or why do good people suffer and die young? Why do good people suffer at the hands of bad people? Have you ever asked God the question why? And we discovered over the past few weeks that the prophet Habakkuk was asking some of those same questions almost 3,000 years ago. Last week we read from Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, and Habakkuk said this, "I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint." He laid out all of these complaints, these questions that just life didn't make sense. The things that were going on didn't make sense. And then it goes on to say, then the Lord replied, "Write down the revelation and make it plain on tablets so that a herald may run with it. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay." All right, so there were three things that I shared last week that I believe we can do when God doesn't seem to make sense, when the world around us doesn't make sense, or when life doesn't seem to make sense. And the first thing was that it's critical that we go to a place where we can actually hear from God. Habakkuk talked about going up to the ramparts. He got to this place, this watchtower, where he could actually see and hear from God. I don't have to tell you that life is hard. It's even harder when we're not inviting God to speak into our lives. You have to make it a priority to get to a place where you can actually hear and you can see God when he speaks to you. The second thing is that you share what God shows you. Habakkuk put himself in a position to hear from God, and God says to Habakkuk, "Write down the message I'm going to give you." So what? So a herald can run and he can tell everyone about it. We're all writing a story. You may not be writing a story in pen and paper, but every single one of us are writing a story. And last week I asked this question, what is the story that you're writing? What is the message that you're sharing, that you're passing along to the people around you? Who are you sharing your story with? And the third thing that we can see that we can learn from this last week's story in Habakkuk is that we need to wait on God's timing. And that really might be the hardest thing to do. I think sometimes it's the hardest thing to just wait, because I know what I want God to do, and I know when I want God to do it. And so when God asks me to wait, sometimes that's the hardest thing to do. But I know that I can trust God's timing, because God's timing is always the right timing. He says in that scripture, wait for the appointed time. God has the timing down. And listen, when God promises you something, you can count on it. He's going to come through on his word. In verse 4, God says, "See, the enemy is puffed up. His desires are not upright, but the righteous person will live by his faithfulness." And so God says that the righteous are going to live by what? By faith, right? The righteous are going to live by faith, not by what they see, not by what's going on in the world around them, but instead the righteous are going to live by faith. And last week we said that faith is trusting what God is doing, even when we cannot see what God is doing. We're going to trust what God is doing, even when we cannot see what God is doing. Faith is choosing to trust that God is at work in my life and in the world around me, even when it's not obvious that God is at work, even when I cannot see God at work. Faith is choosing to trust that God is indeed at work. And God says, again, that the righteous person will live by what? By faith. The righteous person will live by faith. So last week I encouraged you to put yourself in a position to hear from God, to share what God has shown you, and to be willing to wait on God's timing. The righteous will live by faith. Well, this week we're going to move into Habakkuk 3, and we don't have it on the PowerPoint, so you're going to have to open up a Bible. Those are those books in front of you that actually say there's one that's a hymnal, one that's a... there should be some in front of you there. I invite you to open up to that. Habakkuk is like about maybe 2/3 of the way in. You're going to go past Psalms, but before Matthew. Okay, so if you're looking for it, it's going to be right in there. Look up Habakkuk. We're going to be moving into Habakkuk chapter 3 this morning. And we're going to be wrapping up this series in Habakkuk. And so I'm going to highlight some of the verses. I'm going to read a few, but some of them are just going to kind of highlight. So you can kind of read through it with us. But we're going to start in verse 2, chapter 3, verse 2. And Habakkuk says this in verse 2. "Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Lord, repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. He says, Lord, I have heard of your fame. He says, I stand in awe of your deeds. And then what does he say? He says, renew them in our day. In our time, God, make them known. He's saying, God, I remember. I've heard about your miracles. I've heard about your power. I've heard about your glory. I remember them. Do it again, God. Do it again in our day and do it again in our time. If I'm being really honest, there are seasons in my life where God's presence seems more real than other seasons. Are any of you like that? There are seasons in my life when God's presence feels stronger. I feel like I'm closer to God. And there are other times when maybe I just don't feel, like sometimes it feels like God is distant. I know he's not. Scripture teaches us that. But there are seasons, there are times when I feel like God is absent. And it's in those seasons that I find myself saying, God, I know that you can. I know you can, but you're not. I've seen you do it before. God, would you do it again? I know that you can do it, God. Would you do it again? And that's very much what Habakkuk is saying here in verse 2. So again, I want us to reflect on this question that has continued to come up throughout this series in Habakkuk. How do you respond when God doesn't make sense? What do you do when you are struggling and God doesn't make sense or the world around you doesn't make sense? What do you do when circumstances around you just do not seem to be getting any better? And there are a few things that we can see, again, in Habakkuk, in this chapter, that I believe we can directly apply to our lives. The first one is this. We're going to learn to remember what God has done. We're just going to remember what God has done. We're going to look back, and we're going to remember his faithfulness. We're going to remember the character and the goodness of God. We're going to remember what God has done. Last week, we talked about recording or writing down what God shows us, and part of that is so that we can share that with others. But another reason is that God encourages us to write down our faith experiences so that we can go back and we can remember those, that we can be reminded of those things. And that's what Habakkuk is doing here in chapter 3. He's going to look back at some very tangible and some very visible things that are going to trigger spiritual memories, because those things can trigger memories, right? We all know there are things that trigger memories for us. For instance, smells can trigger memories, right? So some of you had Thanksgiving dinner, and maybe for you it was a pie that Grandma made. And whenever you smell a pie like that, or maybe it's the lemon cake, right? Amanda's granny made lemon cake. Anytime I smell a lemon cake, what am I reminded of? I'm reminded of Granny's lemon cake, right? I can go back in my mind and I can sit in that kitchen and I can see her pulling out that lemon cake that she would always make. Smells can do that, right? Some of you have those same things. There's smells that trigger memories. They take you right back to a certain moment in a certain place. It could be a song. There are specific songs that I hear that immediately in my mind take me back to a particular place and a time. I can hear a song. I think Trey and Amanda can relate to me on this one. I can hear a song, and it will immediately take me right back to South Vermilion High School lunchroom. Because we had this jukebox, and they played these two songs every single time. I'm not going to tell you what they are, but there were two songs that they played every single time at lunch. And I hear those songs, and I'm immediately taken right back to my lunchroom in high school. For some of us, I can hear a song, and it takes me right back to my bedroom next to the tape recorder. Because I'd have the radio playing, and I'm waiting. Oh, man. Right? If you don't know the struggle of waiting for the right song on the radio and trying to tape it, you need to talk to your mom and dad, because it was a real struggle. Oh, man, you don't have that today. Or here's one. Every time I hear the Queen song, We Will Rock You, I'm taken right back to my senior year of wrestling. Because the coach played that song every time we came out. And the cool thing is, during a match, if it was close, the parents, they would start doing this. So every time I hear that song, it's like I get all, we're ready to go, right? It just takes me right back to high school wrestling. All right, you didn't need to know that, but I'm sharing it with you anyway. I don't know what it is for you, but there are certain things that trigger memories, and that's what Habakkuk is going to do as he goes down this memory lane, this journey of just remembering the goodness and the faithfulness and the power of God. Again, if you have a Bible, look at verse 3. He says this, he says, there was a time, he says, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran, and his glory covered the heavens and his praise filled the earth. Now you're reading that like me. The first time I read it, you're scratching your head and you're thinking, what on earth does this place mean? What's he talking about? Well, to God's people, they would know exactly what he's talking about, because whenever God delivered the Israelites out of Egypt and he parted the Red Sea and they went through and the sea closed up and the Egyptians drowned, this is the place that God took his people to. This is the place that he took them to. It was the place that they found refuge and they started to become the people of God again. And so he's saying, I remember that place. Just as God would often have people build an altar to remember who God is or what God did, or similarly, the way that we take communion to celebrate and remember Jesus' sacrifice on the cross, this is what Habakkuk is doing. Verses 4, 5, and 6, he says this, God, your splendor, it was like the sunrise. The rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. Verse 5, it says, plague went before him. Pestilence followed his steps. He stood and shook the earth. And I like this verse. He says, he looked and made the nations trembled. God just looked and the nations trembled. My mom has a look like that. When she gives me that look, I just tremble, even today. It's terrifying. Habakkuk goes on and he says, the ancient mountains crumbled and the age-old hills collapsed. And he says, but God, he goes on forever. God is eternal. And then here's what Habakkuk does. You can read it in verses 7 through 15. I'm going to kind of skim through it real quick. He goes through this very detailed explanation of remembering when God displayed his glory and his power through nature. In fact, you can almost imagine Habakkuk saying, God, I remember these times. I remember the stories when you guided your people by fire and by a cloud. And I remember when you fed us with bread from heaven. And I remember when the waters parted and we walked through. And I remember when you shook the earth and the walls came tumbling down. And I remember when you used torrential rains to defeat the enemy. And I remember when you used pestilence and plagues. And God, I remember what you're capable of. I know what you can do. God, would you renew those in our day? Would you do it again? When I'm struggling to make sense of what God is or what God is not doing, sometimes I just have to remember. I need to be reminded. I go back and I remember who God is. When I don't see him, when I feel like sometimes God is absent, I just remember what he's done in the past. I remember who he is. For me, I've shared some of these stories through this series, but for me, many times I go back to the ways that God showed up through our story of infertility and adoption. And Amanda and I have story after story. I mean, we could talk for hours about the way God has shown up. There are moments in every single one of our kids' stories. And sometimes I just need to go back and be reminded that God came through in some very powerful ways through our adoption stories. I remember how he provided the exact attorney we needed, and exactly what that attorney needed when we adopted Jace. I remember how even though we had a match with a birth mom that was due with a baby girl at the end of April, even though she changed her mind around March, we kept all the stuff that we had purchased, and God delivered Macy to us at the last minute, right at the end of April. I remember how God brought Penelope into our home at 7 days old, and he ensured that she would stay with us until we could adopt her at 2 years old. I remember how God spoke to me through an email. I've never heard God audibly speak, but this was about as close as it has ever come. And he brought Colby into our home. I remember how much Amanda and I felt like a second set of parents to Nathan when he was a baby and a toddler, never imagining that God would use that connection later on. I remember how God gave Amanda, I shared this I think last week, God gave Amanda a word about Silas. And 7 years later, I had my doubts, I'm telling you. 7 years later, God came through on his word. You see, sometimes you just have to remember what God has done. You have to remember who he is. Now, some of you are going to go, I can't say that I've ever had anything like that happen. But here's the deal. For those of you that are believers, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ for any length of time, I guarantee if you think about it, God's going to show you some things that he has done in your life. It could be a time when you didn't know what to do. You were at your wit's end and you just came to church. And it might just be, you would say, you know what, it might as well have just been me and God. Because, Pastor, that word you were preaching was right for me. It was like God was speaking directly to me in this moment, and I needed to hear that right in that moment and in that time. You can remember that. Or maybe it was a time where you were hurting and you turned on the radio and you're driving along and this song comes on. And it was just like God played that song for you. The lyrics of that song were talking about right where you are in the moment of your hurt and your need. And God ministered to you through that song. Or it could have been something as simple as one day you're reading the Bible and you come across a verse and you're like, man, if this verse was for anyone, it was written for me. And you just remember how God encouraged you through that verse. It could be as simple as when you were hurting and there was someone that prayed for you and they called you or texted you and said, hey, I just want you to know I'm praying for you. I don't know why. God put you in my heart. I'm praying for you. And you knew that God sent that person for you right when you needed them to be praying for you. You go back and you remember. What do you do when God doesn't make sense? You remember what God has done. God, I remember your glory. I remember your power. I remember your deeds. Renew them in your day. God, you've done it before, and I believe you can do it again. The first thing you do is you remember. The second thing you do, and this one's not easy, but the second thing that we do is that we accept what God is doing. We accept what God is doing. Now, again, this may be one of the hardest ones. In fact, I think this can be extremely hard, which is why so many of us struggle with it. But there are times when God doesn't make sense, but even though I don't understand, I just need to accept what God is doing. When God has spoken or revealed his plan, there are times we just need to accept that plan. Especially when he has spoken or revealed it to us. We need to accept that plan. Now, this doesn't mean that we just stop praying for a miracle. It doesn't mean that we just stop asking God to change our circumstances. But it does mean that there are times when God will give us an answer. It's not the answer we were hoping for. It's not really the answer we wanted. But he's given us an answer. And there's times when we just need to accept his answer. And sometimes, again, this is really hard to do. I was thinking about that with my kids, right? There are times when I'm having conversations with my kids and I tell them to do something, and what do they say? Why? And if I've heard why once, I've heard it 1,000 times, right? Why? Well, because Dad told you to. Why? Listen, there are some things our kids, you know this, there are some things our kids don't understand. I'm asking them to do something. I can't explain everything. There's some things I ask them to do that even if I try to explain it, they're not going to get it. So you just need to accept what Dad's telling you. Just do what I'm asking you to do. See, we need to do the same thing with God. There are times when God gives us a message. He tells us something. He reveals something. We don't always like it, but we just need to accept what God is revealing to us, right? And this is really hard to do. So many times, instead of accepting what God is doing, sometimes we just kind of put our head in the sand. Now, I know nobody here does that, but you know people like that, right? When you tell them something and it's a hard truth and they just kind of ignore it, they put their head in the sand and they don't want to admit that change. Like you go to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, you got some issues here, you need to make some lifestyle changes, and you're like, okay, and you go home and you don't do anything and just kind of, it'll be okay, and you kind of put your head in the sand, right? When your marriage is in trouble and your spouse says, hey, we need counseling, and they just say, it'll work out, and they put their head in the sand. Sometimes when finances are bad and people say, but I want the house, I want the car, I want the lifestyle. So they buy the house and they buy the car and they just kind of put their head in the sand. When the storm is coming and Christians don't prepare, they don't face the truth. See, too many people, we just deny the reality of what's going on. That doesn't mean that we can't pray for a miracle. That doesn't mean that we can't, we should pray to God that God would show up in some miraculous ways. But if God has spoken clearly, especially when God has spoken clearly and he's revealed some things, then we need to accept what God is doing, even if we don't like it. And you can see this coming about in Habakkuk's verse 16. He says, remember in chapter 1, I'm going to back up. Remember in chapter 1, God says, I'm going to use the Babylonians to do what? To wipe you out. And Habakkuk's like, whoa. What are you talking about, God? Like that, you're going to use those evil people to destroy us? And here's what he says in chapter 3, verse 16. I heard, and my heart pounded. My lips quivered at the sound. Decay crept into my bones, and my legs trembled. That was not what Habakkuk was hoping to hear. But then he says, yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. And I want you to hear this. God has spoken, and he's revealed to Habakkuk what's about to come. And Habakkuk doesn't deny what's about to happen. He looked truth squarely in the face, and he said, this is not going to be a fun season. There's going to be a lot of innocent people that are going to die. Probably me and probably some people that I really love. There's going to be a lot of bloodshed, and I don't like it, but I trust God even when I don't understand. It's not a denial, but he says the sovereign hand of God is doing something here. God has spoken, and so I'm going to accept what God is doing, as difficult as it is for me to accept. And there are times in my own life I've had this, when God has given me an answer that I didn't like, and I've just had to accept it. Now, I will say this, I don't know this will happen every time, but I'd say most of the time, when I don't like God's answer and I accept it, somewhere down the road, he comes through in some really big ways. And he shows up in some really powerful ways. And I look back and I think, man, again, you knew better than I did. Your plan was so much better than mine, right? But sometimes we just need to accept what God is doing. So we remember what God has done. We accept what God is doing. Now here's the beauty and the power of whatever it is that you're going through. Number 3, Habakkuk teaches us to trust what God is going to do. You're going to trust what God is going to do. That's the third thing. Trust what God is going to do. We remember what he did, we accept what he's doing, and we trust what he is going to do. And we find this very clearly in verses 16 through 18, probably not only some of my favorite verses in Habakkuk, but maybe in the whole Bible. These are some of my favorite verses, 16 through 18. Here's what Habakkuk says. He says, I don't understand and I don't like it. The Babylonians, they should get theirs. They're an evil people, and we're getting ours, and I still don't like it. Yet he says, I will do what? Yet I will wait patiently for the day of calamity to come on the nation invading us. He says, I don't like it, but I'm going to wait. In Babylon, they're going to get theirs because God has told me that, and I'm trusting God's word. Then he says this in verse 17, and these are the verses I really love. He says this in verse 17 and 18. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will what? I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God my Savior. He says, even though I have no reason whatsoever to rejoice, he says, yet I will what? Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. And I will be joyful in whom? I will be joyful in God my Savior. When he has no reason whatsoever, physically and visibly, to rejoice, he says, even though the fig tree doesn't bud, yet I will rejoice in my God. Even though there are no cattle in the barn, yet I will rejoice in my God. Habakkuk is really saying, even though I don't understand, even if God doesn't answer my prayer in the way that I want him to, even if God doesn't seem to come through for me, even though I don't like what God is doing, even when God doesn't seem to make sense, yet I will worship him. I will worship him. Even in the hurt, even in the unknown, even in the pain and the confusion of infertility and fostering and adoption, yet I will worship God. In your life, it may be, even though I raised my kids to know better, and they're making some really scary decisions right now, and I don't know how this is going to turn out right now, but yet I will choose to trust in the Lord my God. Even though we've prayed for someone physically to get better, and they're actually gotten worse, yet I will choose to trust the Lord my God. Even though finances are tough and I'm not sure how I'm going to fill my gas tank or get groceries this week, yet I will trust in the Lord. Even though I don't like it. Even though I don't understand it. Even though I know he could. Man, in my mind he should. But he's not. Yet I will trust in the Lord my God. Even when God doesn't make sense to me, yet I will worship him. See, I'm praying that you can develop a Habakkuk chapter 3 type of faith. That's my prayer. Because here's what I can say after walking with Christ most of my life. He has never, ever failed me. He has never failed me. And I've walked enough with God, and he's proven himself over and over and over again. And I've witnessed his faithfulness in the past, and now I trust him with all of my tomorrows. Man, I just pray that you experience that kind of faith. that no matter what you're going through in life, even when God doesn't make sense, that you've walked with him, that you've seen him move enough, that he's done enough things in your life that you can look back and you can say, God, I don't get it. I don't understand it. Yet I will worship you. Yet I will trust you. If not yet, one day, that you would have the kind of faith that says, I know you're a good God. I know that you're faithful. I know you've come through for me before, and I know that you're going to come through for me again. That you've walked with him, maybe not yet, but one day, that you've walked with him in enough yesterdays that you can trust him with all of your tomorrows. That even when God doesn't make sense, you can say, yet I will worship him.